I've been let loose in this absolute paradise of interfacing and interlining and wadding, and I can't believe that I can just look at it and see all these lovely things that I don't know what half of them are. I don't normally pre-wash my fabric because, well, just because I don't. So we're going to talk about turning your basic quilt topper that you have carefully made into a quilt sandwich in preparation for finishing your quilt. How to take your quilt to the next level. When it comes to actually sewing your quilting, once you've finished the piecing and you're doing the sewing now to do the quilting part of it, a question arises as to what sort of a needle that you're going to use. If you're doing stitching in the ditch, which is stitching in the channel between the joined sections of the quilt, like I've got here, I've stitched down here, this is quilt stitching in the ditch. That's just going to be straight stitching, so I would use either a walking foot or the IDT if you've got a machine that's got the extra little foot on the back, because that helps it feed through quicker. You're sewing with 3 layers of fabric here, and the middle one's quite puffy, so that makes a difference. And as to the needle, I would use a Microtex needle, probably about a size 80. For thread, you want to choose a colour for the top that's going to melt into your background. I generally use a grey like this, and I really like this Masterpiece thread 50 weight, and that blends in really quite nicely. Even where the stitching shows, it doesn't show up too badly because the colour blends in nicely. On the back, I wanted the quilting lines to show up a little bit more, so I used a heavier weight thread, and I chose a pink. This is a variegated pink, which goes quite nicely with the backing thread, and that's a 40 weight, so that shows up a little bit more. When it comes to choosing a suitable backing fabric, you can buy quilting fabric in an extra wide width, which generally doesn't need joining together, so that saves a lot of time. I have successfully joined normal widths to make the size that I need for my backing, and this particular piece, this is just dressmaking fabric. It's a nice quality, tightly woven cotton, and because this quilt's going to be made of small pieces sewn together, it doesn't matter that it's narrower. It's very tempting to use something you've got lying around at home, but don't be tempted to use an old sheet or something cheap that you've got lying around. You've put an awful lot of work into your quilt and you want it to last well, so it's worth spending a little bit extra and getting something to make a nice job. You can also use your backing fabric to bind the edge of the quilt, so you get more value out of it and a nice finish. And if you use the same material to bind as you use for the backing, if you make any mistakes on the sewing on the back, it doesn't show up as much. Another question that arises is pre-washing of quilting fabric. Some people say yes, some people say no, don't bother. The waddings all have a certain shrinkage percentage in them. They will shrink between 3 and 5%. You can pre-soak them. I wouldn't put one in a washing machine and put it through a wash cycle, but pre-soaking is recommended on the packaging. You have to read the manufacturer's directions. What you will find that if you need to test whether you pre-wash or pre-soak your batting, you pre-wash or pre-soak your fabric, or you don't do any of it, which is what I do. What happens if you don't do any of it beforehand? When you wash it, this is a quilt that's been washed lots of times, and you can see that it's gone a bit crinkly. Well, I quite like that crinkled look. If you prefer your quilt to stay pristine and flat, then you need to do the preparation before you start, and then you won't get this. You can see the texture on the back. This to me looks used and like a quilt should. It isn't a work of art, it's an item of everyday use. The choice is up to you, but you can test the various samples and see what happens. Quilts can be made in lots of different sizes, from really small ones that are pieces this size right up to king size, super king size bed quilts, which are quite difficult to handle because of the size of them. But it's important that you don't waste too much batting, you make good use of it. So it is available in lots of different sizes, ranging from king size, queen size, twin size, buying it by the metre off the roll, or even down to small craft size pieces. My preference is to buy it from on the roll because I quite like the offcuts, and very often I've got use for a small piece of batting that I don't want to go out and buy a whole piece from. But look at the size of your finished quilt that you're making, and then look at the sizes that the manufacturers offer, and you've got loads of choice. Choose the one that's suitable for your size. It's also quite difficult to cut a large piece if you've got limited space, so it's quite sensible to choose one that's nearer to the finished size that you're actually going to produce.